My Kako, a Come-On Curtain Call, a program of reviews, previews, interviews, and features of and or with the great art and artists on Maui and beyond. I'm Paul James Brown. With an estimated 20 million copies sold worldwide since it was published in 1965, Frank Herbert's classic science fiction story Dune is reputed by the Sci-Fi Channel as the best-selling science fiction novel of all time. The Denis Villeneuve version, despite being released last Friday, October 22nd, simultaneously on HBO Max and in theaters, has grossed $220 million worldwide and broke Warner Brothers box office records with an opening weekend of $40.1 million. However, the 1984 Dino De Laurentiis-David Lynch collaboration was universally panned by the critics. Roger Ebert said, quote, "This movie is a real mess, an incomprehensible, ugly, unstructured, pointless excursion into the murkier realms of one of the most confusing screenplays of all time," unquote. At the New York Times, Janet Maslin joined the chorus of boos. Quote, "Several of the characters in Dune are psychic, which puts them in the unique position of being able to understand what goes on in the movie. The plot of Dune is perilously overloaded, as is virtually everything else about it," unquote. Apple TV is giving Dune lovers a chance to see what the critics and the public hated so much. The film lost about $11 million of its $42 million budget, grossing only $30.9 million in box office sales worldwide. In fact, the director David Lynch has admitted this film was his only failure, and he refuses to talk about it. However, in the introduction to his 1985 collection, Mr. Herbert said, "I enjoyed the film, even as a cut, and I told it as I saw it. What reached the screen is a visual feast that begins as Dune begins, and you hear my dialogue all through it." He also commented, "I have my quibbles about the film, of course. Paul was a man playing God, not a god who would make it rain." Being made available on Apple TV the same day the Denis Villeneuve 2021 Dune is debuting gives the viewers the opportunity to compare the two. And although I never read the book, I found Mr. Lynch's version compelling, visually sumptuous, especially the costumes by Bob Ringwood, and unlike most of the contemporary criticism at the time, I found no problem following the storyline. My sense is Lynch's style of storytelling was far ahead of its time, hence the lack of comprehension from many critics. The dream quality of Lynch's narrative and the actors' psychic nature gave them moments where they were truly acting because their dialogue was in their head. This was particularly effective when Paul's mother, Bene Gesserit Jessica, and he are being transported to the desert to become a snack for the sandworms after having been captured by the Harkonnen. In the current version, Villeneuve has Paul's mother, and he used sign language to communicate rather than telepathy. And in a nod to Lynch, he only gives us part one of the story, presumably like Lynch wanted, but De Laurentiis didn't. The story will be presented in at least 2 and perhaps 3 parts in the future. Despite the myriad criticisms about the tawdry special effects in the Lynch Dune, I thought they were quite effective, and I found myself willingly suspending disbelief. The worms look identical. While the Villeneuve Dune concludes with Paul and Jessica joining the Fremen, the Lynch goes into the struggle against the Baron. Besides the superior look of the Lynch Dune, primarily to its stylishness, the Villeneuve version is sparse. The dwellings are stripped of any ornamentation. The lack of diversity in the cast of the 1984 Dune is more than compensated for in the Villeneuve version, including not only changing the race of Dr. Kynes, but also the gender. In the Lynch version, Kynes is Max von Sydow, and in the Villeneuve, Dr. Kynes is Sharon Duncan Brewster. Of the 18 leads in the Villeneuve version, 8 are people of color, and 1, Javier Bardem, as Stilgar, is Hispanic. In the Lynch film, there is 1 Hispanic, Jose Ferrer as the Emperor, and no persons of color in any lead roles. Because Mr. Villeneuve's version is only half of Herbert's book, we don't get to see Alia, the daughter of Jessica and Duke Leto. Lynch cast the debut of an 8-year-old Alicia Rowan Witt, and I must say she is brilliant in the film. Ms. Witt has gone on to a distinguished 30-year career as an actor, singer, and songwriter. One of the characters completely omitted from the Villeneuve version is the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. Played by Jose Ferrer in the Lynch version, the Emperor is a key element in the plot and provides Paul with a victim in the conclusion. Also not present in the Villeneuve version is Fade Rauta, played by Sting in the scene-stealing fashion. He is an eye magnet, and the camera loves him. It will be interesting, should the sequel be made, and given the response both critically and at the box office, it is almost a certainty, to see who Mr. Villeneuve gets to play him. Finally, the character of Princess Irulan, the lovely Virginia Madsen, who provided background information in the opening of the earlier film, is absent from the new version. In her place, Chani, played by Zendaya, takes on that role in the opening of the new version. The character of Stilgar, played by Hawaii's own Jason Momoa, is greatly expanded in this new version, as would be expected with a star of Mr. Momoa's magnitude. In the Lynch version, Everett McGill's Stilgar only has a few scenes and gets killed off before the film is half over. Now we come to one of the most dramatic differences between the two versions: the characters of the villain, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Mr. Lynch cast Shakespearean Kenneth Macmillan, whose over-the-top theatrical portrayal gives a maniacal, almost comical quality to the character that Stellan Skarsgård's dark and introverted portrayal never achieves, and although both are overweight and float around, Mr. Macmillan's boil-infected face isn't imitated by Skarsgård. The character of Gurney Halleck is Sir Patrick Stewart, and in the new version, it's Josh Brolin. Could there be a more stark contrast? Golda Rosheuvel has the unenviable task of trying to make us forget about the wonderful, quirky, and intense Linda Hunt, who portrayed Shadat Mapes, the maid housekeeper in the Lynch version. Spoiler alert, the traitor Dr. Wellington Yui is Dean Stockwell in the Lynch version and Chen Chang in the new one. Chang brought a sinister quality to the character that Stockwell's Dr. Yui didn't reveal until he betrays the Atreides. Both Mr. Chalamet and Mr. McLaughlin created sympathetic Pauls, but because Mr. McLaughlin got to his total transformation as the Muad'Dib, and Mr. Chalamet won't get there until the sequel, I have to give the award for best performance to Mr. McLaughlin. Now we come to yet another stark contrast: Paul's love interest Chani. Zendaya is Chani in the new one, and Sean Young played her in the Lynch version. Zendaya is initially standoffish, almost hostile to Paul, but there are definitely sparks, and we can see them as he and his mother Jessica go off to join the Fremen. Sean Young has the opportunity to fully realize her love with Paul because of the difference in the storylines. Finally, we come to Paul's mother, Lady Jessica Atreides, who is not the Duke's wife, but his concubine. Rebecca Ferguson seems mostly to be in a coma. Her blank stare is in stark contrast to Frances Annis's strong portrayal of a lioness protecting her cub. Both films are worth seeing. David Lynch, whose achievements include The Elephant Man, Mulholland Drive, and one of the best television series of all time, Twin Peaks, is a legend, and most recognize his genius, and, as with many geniuses, they are ahead of their time. In bringing Dune to the screen, Mr. Lynch was way ahead of his time. This is why so many critics did not get the story he was telling. Mr. Villeneuve, a Canadian director, has gotten his biggest break with this film. Prior to this, he did Blade Runner 2049 and Sicario, and a well-received short, Next Floor, and despite its bare look, has struck a chord with critics and audiences. Where Mr. Lynch's Dune was a flop, losing $11 million, Mr. Villeneuve's worldwide gross has already eclipsed his $180 million budget by $40 million. You can rent Mr. Lynch's Dune for 99 cents on Apple TV, and I recommend you see Mr. Villeneuve's interpretation in the cinema. If you cannot, it is streaming on HBO Max. Well, that's Curtain Call for this week. Next week, I'll be reviewing Maui Onstage and ProArt's production of the comic thriller Clue. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Paul James Brown. Ahui ho!